seeing them worship. And that, I was sitting there thinking, like, that's why we want our kids in here with us. So that's awesome. I hope you had a great Thanksgiving. I know everybody that I've asked, how was your Thanksgiving? Everybody touches their belly. And I feel the exact same way. That's what we had, a huge dinner on Thursday, huge dinner on Friday. Thank you, Tiffany. And I feel like, I gained 5 pounds at each dinner, and, it's going to take 5 months to work it off because that is the stage of life I'm in. So that's the metabolism has slowed down significantly. But I'm not going to change my eating habits on Thanksgiving, and I'm not going to change my hunting habits, which do not help metabolism either at this time of year. But it kind of hit me yesterday afternoon. I was in the deer stand yesterday afternoon and thinking, and it's kind of, I was thinking about this vision that we cast for Year in Giving, and I thought it's really interesting, the Sunday before Thanksgiving, we introduced that we were going to try to help launch a new food pantry. And Mount Pleasant is specifically where it would be, and we're going to help the well outreach. And it kind of hit me thinking, most of us last week struggled with an overindulgence of food. We had too much food. We threw away almost as much food as we ate. Like it was, there was just food everywhere. And there's families in our community that struggle with not enough food, especially kids, because teachers will tell you, like when the kids aren't able to be at school during the week, there's kids that have food insecurity at home and, not being able to have the lunch and not being able to have breakfast. And it's just it's this weird dichotomy we're in America, where a good percentage of us struggle with too much food, and there's another percentage of us that struggle with not enough food. And that's kind of what the Well Outreach is focused on addressing, is trying to help people have enough food for their families, to feed their families, and to maybe supplement. A lot of them, have jobs and have an income and are working somewhere. It's just the cost of groceries. You guys know that better than anybody, this last week. Cost of groceries has gotten so crazy that, they need a place like this to kind of supplement what they're purchasing. And so we're going to help the Well Outreach. If you missed that announcement last week, they're in Spring Hill. And it's a food pantry in Spring Hill. It was started by Wellspring Christian Church, which started about the same time as Murray Hills. And it's a church real similar to Murray Hills. It birthed out of the Restoration Movement as well. Andy Huddleston is their pastor. And they started it to help families in Spring Hill. But they've been growing exponentially. And they recently announced that they want to move and have a second location in Mount Pleasant. It's the old Fred's building. And so we want to help them get started with the second location. And so we kind of agreed to partner with them to, what we're trying to do is pay their rent, possibly, and I was nervous to even suggest this to the executive director, but possibly for the year. Possibly we would raise enough money that we could cover your rent for the year. Like, how many families could you serve if you started your new location rent-free? You didn't have to worry about that expense. How many more families could you help? And we love starting new ministries at this church, and we love helping get new ministries get started. And so this was it's not a new ministry, it's an established ministry, but it's a new location. And so last week I introduced kind of that whole vision. And if you missed it, you weren't here, I put it on YouTube. So you can go back and just watch that 3-minute clip where I talk about it. Today, I want to tell you what they do so that you know a little bit more about what the Well Outreach does. And then next week, Shelly's actually going to be with us, their executive director, and she's going to talk about the why. So to explain the what, I'm going to let you watch a little 2.5-minute video. And this is something that I found on YouTube that they apparently did last year for a Year in Giving campaign last year. But it just does a great job of kind of explaining what the Well Outreach does. So watch this.
The Well started as a local ministry at a local church back in 2006, when the population of Spring Hill was only 11,000 people. Fast forward 15 years, here we are today in 2022 with record high serving numbers and a population of 55,000. Right now, the Well is serving about 715 families a month. This time last year, we were serving about 350 to 400 families a month. 2022 has been a record year for the Well in the number of families that we've served. We've gone up almost 100% in the number of families that we've served from last year to this year. And what we've seen is just a variety of reasons, from rising food costs to increase of gas, the ability to be able to come to the Well and to offset. We also are helping families who are on a fixed income, families that are on a disability income. And so when those kinds of rising costs goes up, there's nowhere else to turn. And so they come to the Well for food.
We've actually just learned that it takes about 13,000 pounds of food every week to service the need. We're simply not hitting that. Every once in a while we'll have food drives come in, we'll hit that number, but more times than not we're just under 10,000 pounds of food. Yeah, we can always feed and we have the food to give. We're not at the point. It's getting a little uncomfortable.
Because of the increased need this year, because of the rising costs of food and gas, the Well is in need of your community's support to help us offset food expenses, staffing expenses, expenses to feed more people. Please consider walking alongside the Well at year-end with a gift of financial support. The Well, our board of directors, and our Well team would like to offer and wish you a very Merry Christmas as you prepare for year-end. For more information on how to help the Well with a financial gift, go to springhillwell.org. Thank you.
All right, so just a little introduction there. You don't even have to do that. You can just wait till December 17th. So we're taking up an offering on December 17th to where that we hope to provide most, if not all, of their first year's rent. One statistic they didn't mention in the video, about 60 to 65% of the families they serve now live in Columbia or Mount Pleasant. And so you can imagine the difficulty. Any of you who've driven up to Spring Hill lately, we were having that conversation yesterday. We went shopping downtown Columbia, and I don't even like driving any further north than I have to go shopping because it's just, the population. And, so you can imagine if you're trying to get help with food and you got to do an hour round trip to go spend gas money and get food. So the Mount Pleasant location is going to be a fantastic location for them, and we hope to help them by getting that thing started. So that's December 17th, and again, Shelly will be with us next Sunday to talk some more about that, and I'll be sending some stuff in the email and all that kind of things. So let's get into Mark. So if you join in for the first time, if you're here over the holidays and it's your first time at Murray Hills, we've been in a study of the Gospel of Mark. It's called Simply Jesus, and it's the longest study I've done in a while. And we did Romans last year, and it was a pretty long study. But this is, I think we're in our 14th week of this study. And so we've got only 3 weeks left. We're going to cover the rest of chapter 14 today, chapter 15 next Sunday, and chapter 16 the following Sunday. And I do that on purpose. You rarely hear me teach verse by verse. You usually hear me teach kind of big idea by big idea because I like to see how all the things are connected. And my idea when I do that is, hey, I'm not going to cover everything in chapter 14. I'm just going to cover parts of chapter 14. I'll just kind of pick out the most important stuff you need to know out of chapter 14, and I'll cover that. I had a really hard time with that this week because everything in chapter 14 I felt like was important, like everything I run across. And the way, to me, this chapter represents the best writing of Mark. Like the way he weaves together this story and the way that he connects everything and the phrases he uses, I'm just like, I got to include as much of it as I possibly can. And so this message, I'm going to try my best to let the story kind of stand on its own. And I want you to see all of it because what he does is he tells the story of two men in this narrative right here. One of them is a man who claims to be the Messiah, and he cements that today in chapter 14. And then the other is the story of a man who wants to follow the Messiah and says he'll follow the Messiah no matter what the cost. And he fails miserably in doing so. So you got the story of Peter woven all throughout this narrative. And you're going to see Jesus' prediction of Peter's denial, the Garden of Gethsemane, the betrayal of Judas, the arrest of Jesus, the first trial of Jesus, which is the Jewish trial, and then Peter's denial of Jesus. And so this is all in chapter 14. So if you got a Bible, you can follow along. We're going to start in verse 27. I'll have everything on the screen as well. So if you don't have a Bible with you, you can follow along on the screen. So verse 26, actually. Let's start back there just a little bit. So last week, Jesus, and this was not last week, this was just a few hours ago from the timeline of the gospel, but Jesus celebrated the Passover with his disciples in the upper room and instituted communion. And it says in verse 26, when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is outside the city gate of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem would have had a wall around the city to protect it, but the Mount of Olives is about a half mile outside of the wall. It's on a mountain or a hill, if you will, that overlooks the city of Jerusalem and sits directly opposite the Temple Mount. So it would have been more secluded. There would have been less crowds, less people around. He could have had more privacy with his disciples. And there was a garden there known as Gethsemane, and that's kind of where all of this takes place on the Mount of Olives. So this is a private setting, Jesus with his disciples. It won't remain private for long, but this is where he says, you will all fall away. For it is written, I'll strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I've risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. And Peter declared, even if all fall away, I will not. And so this is not the first time Peter has corrected Jesus. So like you're familiar with the other story where Jesus kind of predicted his death for the first time, and Peter said, no, that's not the way it's going to happen. That's not how the Messiah works. And Jesus kind of pulled him aside and rebuked him. There's another story that I've never even connected Peter to, but I was reading in a commentary this week, and I was like, yeah, he was a part of that, on the way to Jerusalem. So when Jesus predicted he was going to Jerusalem to die, Peter said, no, you're not. That's not the way it's going to happen. And he rebuked him. Then on the way to Jerusalem, he argued with the other disciples about which one of them was the greatest. I mean, Peter was in that argument, right? So, and Jesus kind of pulled all the disciples aside and rebuked them and said, that's not the way my kingdom works. And so now Jesus says, you're all going to fall away. He had just predicted Judas' betrayal. And they all said, you're not talking about me, you're not talking about me, you're not talking about me. And now Judas is no longer with them because Judas left before they went to the Mount of Olives. And Peter is correcting Jesus like, I will not fall away. I don't care if everybody else falls away, I will not. And Jesus replies, truly I tell you, today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the others said the same. Now, for those of you familiar with this story, you know what happens here. And you know that Peter won't be able to live up to his words. And commentators have been pretty brutal to Peter throughout history. Preachers have been pretty brutal to Peter throughout history for this kind of brass assertion that I will follow you no matter what. And I even read one this week that said, Peter wasn't really a quote-unquote true disciple yet. He didn't really quote-unquote know Jesus yet because, we know what happens after the fact. And I don't know. I'm like, have you ever made a promise that you couldn't keep? You ever been confident in your faith, like so confident and cocky and bold in your faith, like I can do anything, I will not let this defeat me, I will do anything, and before the difficulty comes, before the crisis comes, before the conflict, the controversy comes, and then when the moment comes, you fold? I think all of us, know what this feels like. Like we know what this, like the best analogy I've got is when you were younger, when you just got married and you were younger, and you didn't have kids yet, but your friends had kids, and you went to dinner with them. You remember the conversation on the way home? Like I'll guarantee you one thing, my kids won't act like that. When I have kids, my kids will do this, and my son will do this, and my daughter will do this. I'll tell you one thing. And then you have kids, and what happens? You're humbled, right? You are humbled when you have kids because you were so confident and sure, like I know exactly what I'm going to do, and when this happens, this is the way I'm going to respond. And that's kind of how I see Peter right here. He doesn't know that there's a crowd coming to arrest him. He doesn't know that his life is going to be in danger. He doesn't know that Jesus is going to be arrested that very night. But he's so confident. He's so sure. Like before the fight, he is emphatic that he is going. Like before the fight, he's so emphatic about it. But then when the fight comes, he folds. And I'll tell you what it reminded me of. It reminded me of a TikTok video. So there was a viral prank that went around, and I don't know when this came around, but what they did was they got parents to go tell their kids that they were going to fight somebody. I don't know if you guys saw this, but like they would go tell their young children, they would say, hey, I got to go fight somebody, and they got kids your age, and I need you to go with me because you need to fight their kids. And they were just doing it to see how their kids reacted. And, of course, the kids were like, what? Why? Oh, I don't want to fight him, that kind of thing. Watch this one. This was the best one. It took me a while to dig it up because I don't have a TikTok account, so I had to dig up this on YouTube. It took me a while to find it. And listen closely and see if you can pick out which one of these daughters is Peter.
Girls, I need you to get your shoes on.
Why?
Because I got to go fight someone and they have 2 daughters and I need you to fight their daughters.
Why?
Are you ready to fight?
Yes!
You don't want to fight?
How big are these?
They're your size. Can you fight them?
And who's them?
Yes.
One of them was
Yes.
I'm gonna get them.
All right, let's go. Come on.
So, there's no doubt who Peter is, right? That's Peter before the fight. Now, I don't know what would happen if she actually saw the girls and the fight happen. My guess is she would react in the moment more like her older sister. And that's what, like when I see this story of Peter, I feel for the guy because I'm like, that's me, that's us. I can see myself in him. And I think that's why the story is included. And because you remember, Peter inspired this with Mark. So Peter is inspiring a lot of what Mark says. And I think that's one of the reasons that this needs to be in here is because we see ourselves in Peter. We see ourselves so confident and sure, and we'll never do this and we'll never do that, and so emphatic about things. But in the moment of truth, when the moment of truth comes, we can't always live up to those promises. And some of what I see in Peter here is he's still dependent on his own strength and willpower. And your own strength and willpower will fail you every time. I mean, if I'm confident enough, I'm just bold enough, I'm going to follow Jesus with everything I got, it'll fail you every time. He hasn't quite learned to trust in the Spirit yet. And that's kind of what Jesus is helping him do. He really won't learn it, though, until after the resurrection. And after the resurrection, you see a very different Peter. Still bold, but there's a boldness and a humility that kind of fuels with it that comes from the Spirit. So Peter says, if you go back to this right here, I think Mark's making the point. We always focus on Peter's part of the story. I will never disown you. But look at the sentence right after it. All the others said the same. So every disciple of Jesus said, we're with you. We will not leave you. We will not leave you. All right. So verse 32, they went to a place called Gethsemane. And this was still in the Mount of Olives. And Jesus said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, he said to them. Stay here and keep watch. Going a little further, he fell to the ground and he prayed that if possible, the hour might pass him. Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me. Yet not I will, but what you will. Then he returned to his disciples and he found them sleeping. Simon, he said to Peter, are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Pray and watch so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing. What is that? Oh, okay. I got it. The only reason I asked was I was like, if that's a fire alarm and we're supposed to be evacuating, I don't want to just keep preaching and you feel like, well, he's preaching. We can't really leave in the middle of his sermon, but we don't want to. We did that at TPAC. We went to a play at TPAC, and the fire alarm went off, and everybody knew it was going off. And the play kept going, so everybody kept their seats. And the fire alarm went off for 5 minutes, and everybody, just sat in their seat. Like 300 people sat in their seats because the play kept going. And then they finally, one person got up and was like, I think maybe we ought to leave. And, they started going through the aisle. That's all it took, everybody. That one person, they all took off. So anyway, that story cost you nothing. And I'm sure it'll preach in some way. But anyway, where are we? Simon, are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so no one will fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And once more he went away and prayed the same thing. And when he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him. So, he just rebuked them for falling asleep. They just had this bold, I'll never disown you. I'll never leave you. I'm with you to the end. And then they can't even stay awake through the prayers. But do you know that a lot of people are really bothered by this story, the Garden of Gethsemane? There's a lot of people that try their best to explain it away, especially Mark's version, because Mark's version is more real. I shouldn't say more real. Mark is more truthful about the heaviness of the emotions that Jesus is feeling in that moment than the other Gospels. Like Mark says, Jesus was deeply distressed and troubled. And then, he even quotes him as saying, my soul is overwhelmed with the sorrow to the point of death. The reason this troubles some people is some people point at this and say, well, this kind of proves that Jesus was not the Messiah because, he knows he's going to be resurrected, so why would he be scared to go to the cross? Maybe this points out that Jesus is not fully God. I think there's even some people that think like, well, Jesus is losing his nerve here in the Garden of Gethsemane. That's what bothers us about it. It bothers us to see someone that we only see in terms of strength displaying weakness. You know what I mean? Like somebody, like when you see your dad cry, it's like, he doesn't never do that. What's going on? And that's kind of what I think is going on here. It's not a sign of weakness. It's actually a sign of strength, because what it's communicating to us is that Jesus, we got to remember, he was both fully God and fully human. As a human, he experienced all the emotions that we experience. The Bible says we do not have a great high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. He can sympathize with our weaknesses because he felt our weaknesses. And like, are you saying Jesus was worried here? Jesus was anxious? Jesus was scared? Jesus was read it. He experienced those emotions. And what he did was he named the emotions. He took them to God. He asked God to deliver him. And when God didn't, he said, your will be done, not mine. And I think that's exactly what we should do with our emotion. When we feel those things, when we feel afraid, it's not sinful to feel afraid. I think we get that confused sometimes. It's not sinful to feel anxious. It's not sinful to feel something, to feel if I was to say, I feel deeply distressed and troubled, some people feel like, well, that's sinful because you're not trusting in God enough. Jesus was trusting in God enough. It's just he did what we should do when we experience emotion. We take those to God and we ask God for deliverance, but we trust in God no matter what happens. And so I think, to me, this is an example of moral strength. And Mark is comparing and contrasting kind of this moral strength of Jesus with the inability of the disciples to display any strength. They keep falling asleep, and they even do it 3 times. So this is verse 37. It says he returned, 40, at the end here. This is like 40. It says, returning the 3rd time, he said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Enough. The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let's go. Here comes my betrayer. Verse 43, just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared, and with him a crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Do you remember back in the Passover, it said, or right before the Passover, it said Judas had betrayed Jesus. He was just looking for an opportunity. This is the opportunity because he's outside the city walls. It's in a secluded place. This is the opportunity. So Judas knew that they had gone out here. And the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Rabbi, and kissed him. And the men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. I don't think he was aiming for his ear. Am I leading a rebellion, said Jesus, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled. Now, the other gospels tell us that the guy swinging for the guy's head and missed him and got the ear was Peter. I don't know why Mark doesn't tell us it's Peter. Mark leaves him anonymous, but we do know from the other scriptures that it's Peter that does this. And Jesus kind of says, I've been in the temples. I've been there. I've been in Jerusalem many days now. I'm not leading an armed rebellion, an armed resistance. But then look at that next verse there. This is verse 50. Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus, and when they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. So Mark's trying to show us how desperate this situation was, but I want you to think back, like what was it, verse 37, when Peter said, I'll never disown you, every one of them said the same thing, we will never disown you. And now Mark wants us to know that they all disowned him. They all fled. We tend to kind of put this in context. We put the story like, oh, well, this is about Peter's failures and not all the others. They all fled. And that's Mark's trying to make that point of how desperate the situation was. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the teachers of the law came together. And then look at this. Peter followed him at a distance. So Peter fled, but Peter apparently comes back and right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he sat with the guards, and he warmed himself at the fire. So what Mark's going to show us is that there's a trial getting ready to take place with Jesus, inside the chief priest's home, and there's a trial that's going to take place with Peter outside around the fire. Okay, look at this. The chief priest and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, I'll destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days build another, not made with hands. Yet even their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men have been bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? I am, said Jesus. Now this, I wish I'd have seen this 2 months ago, because in our small group, we were having a conversation. You know, I said all along, the Gospel of Mark is to introduce us to the fact that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. Like, that's how the Gospel starts. Verse 1, chapter 1, verse 1, this is the story of Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. And every event that takes place is to introduce that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. But in our small group, you know, several months ago, somebody was like, did Jesus ever claim to be the Son of God? Like, I mean, did he ever say it himself? Like, I get that the scriptures say it. I understand that. Like, I get that Paul and Peter wrote about, you know, Jesus was the Son of God. I get that. And, like, I know that people would ask him, but, I mean, did Jesus ever say he was the Messiah directly? And in the moment, it was like, I think so. But I'm not sure where it is. And that's one of the things I love about small groups. You can ask questions like that in small groups, and it's okay to go, I don't know. I'm going to have to research that a little bit. And then I stumbled across this week, and I'm like, there it is right there. Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? The Son of the Blessed One is just a way to not say God's name. Jewish did not want to say God's name at a reverence, so Blessed One's a reference to God. So he asked him, are you the Son of God? And what does Jesus say? I am. You remember what God told Moses his name was when Moses asked about his name, and God said, my name is I am. I mean, Jesus confirms it right here, that I am the Son of God. This is actually the first time that the Son of God has been uttered by a human mouth in the Gospel of Mark, is when the chief priest asked him that question. Because God said it when he was baptized. God said, this is my Son whom I love. And all the demons acknowledged him as the Son of God, but Jesus told them not to tell anybody. And there's all of these hints that take place throughout the gospel, like when he calms the storm, when he forgives sin, when he heals the sick, when he heals the lame, when he teaches with authority. You know, all these hints and clues are throughout there. He asked the disciples, who do you say I am? And they say, you're the Messiah, the Son of God. You know, so I mean, they don't say the Son of God actually in that. They say, you're the Messiah. But he asked all this, but in this moment, they ask him, are you the Messiah? And he says, I am. And I think this is one of the most significant things that happens in the whole gospel, because if he is the Son of God, then I have to follow him. If he is the Son of God, then I want to yield my life to him. If he is the Son of God, then I'm willing to do anything for him, even die for him. Peter had become convinced he was the Son of God. That's why Peter was so emphatic. He was so emphatic because he knew that Jesus was the Messiah. He knew he was the Son of God, and he was willing to do anything, even die for him. Let's skip ahead. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. And when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. You also were with that Nazarene, Jesus, she said. But he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about, he said, and he went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, this fellow's one of them. And again he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, surely you're one of them, for you're a Galilean. He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. And immediately, the rooster crowed a second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and he wept. Now, it's very easy, as I said earlier, to criticize Peter with the hindsight of history. And I don't fault him here. I feel for him here. because I think his story identifies where all of us are at certain points. Full of bluster and confident faith at one point, full of weary and sleep the next moment, and confused and ashamed the next moment. And I think you kind of see this evolution of Peter throughout the Gospels of this kind of this confident, charge hell with a water pistol type faith, of his young faith. And then as his faith matures, he has to deal with these moments of failure, and he has to deal with these moments of shame, and he has to deal with these moments where maybe he'd fallen asleep. He has to deal with these things. And anybody who's followed Jesus for any length of time has to deal with that. Anybody who, kind of maintains this, confident, I'm going to conquer the whole world, I've got Jesus, and if you don't feel like that, then you're not really following Jesus, and you're not really a true disciple. I reject every bit of that. Anybody who's followed Jesus for any length of time knows how to deal with failure, knows how to deal with not following Jesus as good as we wanted to follow Jesus, even though we're like Peter and like, I'm going to go to the end of the earth and I'll die for you and I'll do whatever. And we know that in the moment we fail to do that. And that's part of faith, and that's part of following Jesus. Now, here's the thing that I want you to see. And I'm going to ruin my chapter 16 sermon with this, but you just got to include it, because this whole story, we see Peter and this whole thing, and Mark keeps pointing him out, like when James and John fell asleep too, but he called out Peter for falling asleep. Peter said, he was not going to disown Jesus. All of them said they were not going to disown Jesus, and they fled. But he points out Peter, and he says Peter followed at a distance. So all through this, he's kind of highlighting the story of Peter. And what I want you to see in chapter 16, you know what happens. Next week, we'll talk about the crucifixion and the burial, and then the resurrection. And in Mark's version of the resurrection, there are angels waiting when the women come to the tomb. I want you to look at chapter 16, verse 6 and 7. Don't be alarmed, he said. This is the angel speaking to the women at the tomb. So 3 days have happened since Peter denied Jesus, broke down and wept. Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go and tell his disciples. Now look at those next two words. And Peter. Go and tell his disciples and Peter. He is going ahead of you into Galilee. And there you'll see him just as he told you. And what I see in this moment, what Ebony was talking about earlier, this is God telling Peter, I see you. It's like Mark wants to point out, make sure Peter, go tell the disciples and Peter. Make sure Peter knows. Make sure he knows that I'm coming back. Make sure he knows that I've resurrected. Make sure he knows that I'm going to meet him in Galilee. Make sure Peter knows. And I think it's a way of Jesus saying that he loved him through every bit of it. He loved the brashy, arrogant Peter, declaiming that he was never going to deny Jesus, knowing that he was going to deny Jesus. Jesus loved him through that. He loved the Peter that couldn't keep his eyes awake in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he loved the Peter that denied him. I mean, the Peter that was confused and ashamed. He loved that Peter. That's what he's saying to us, that he loves every single one of us in that way. And make sure Peter knows. Because guess what God is going to do with that man? He's going to restore him. So Jesus, when he's going to restore him, he's going to forgive him. And he's going to say, you know what? That might be a good guy to build the church around. Like that he might be the rock that I could build my church on, a guy with faith like that. Not a perfect faith, not by any means, but a faith that's real and that's doing his best to follow Jesus and making these mistakes along the way. And Jesus restores him and loves him and says, Peter, you're going to be the one that preaches the first gospel sermon. Peter, you're going to be the one that first leads people to me. You're going to be the one that starts to establish the church. And it's incredible to see the way God works through Peter. So yeah, we'll pick that up. I got to quit. And I've skipped some parts, believe it or not. But we'll pick that up next week when we move into chapter 15. What Jesus got arrested for and what convicted him was blasphemy to the Jews. When he said he was the Son of God, that's blasphemy to the Jews. It's treason to the Romans. And we'll pick up where it's treason to the Roman next week. Let me pray. We got just to mention our offering, we'll be done. Father, I want to thank you for this story, and I'm thankful that you include the beautiful parts of Scripture and the ugly parts of Scripture. I'm thinking, like, if we were writing the narrative, we'd be tempted to write out parts like Peter or parts like Judas. And, you know, when we write church histories, we kind of write out some of the ugly parts. But that's just part of, it's part of us. It's part of being human. It's part of who we are. It's why we need you in our lives. And so I'm thankful for the truth and the way that Mark writes this to us and just tells us the whole story as it is. And I pray that we could learn from that you are with us and that you love us no matter what. You love us. And we're thankful for that, and help us to learn to yield our lives to you and to yield our lives to your Spirit. And it's in the name of your Son, Jesus, we pray these things. Amen. The last thing, I'll just put this on the screen because I went a little bit longer than I intended today. But the giving. So if you're leaving today, there are boxes around the room. If you're giving by check, you can go online and give. You can give with the text giving, and we'll just leave that on the screen.